And we continue our series with Professor Liah Greenfeld. Today we'll talk about the fascinating book, Mind, Modernity, and Madness. And there are a few questions which are, exceptionally important for us scholars following your work, but also for a general audience, I bet. One of them is to assert that connection between egalitarian society and mental illness has been overlooked. Can you elaborate on this connection and how it forms the central argument of your book?
The interesting thing about mental illness, the functional mental illness, is a problem in public health. And today, functional mental illness is a problem in public health. We are talking about such diseases as depression, severe depression, as bipolar disorder, which is manic depression, and as schizophrenia. And if you study history, those diseases, while in certain individual cases, of course, they always existed, as a public health problem emerged only in the 16th century. So before, there would be some individual cases. They would be very extraordinary. Sometimes people would pay attention, but they didn't affect societies. From the 16th century on, the rates of those diseases jumped to such an extent that this became a point of concern and notice for anyone living in those societies. And we know today in the United States, the rates have reached the incredible 42%. We are talking about 42% of mentally ill people. This is among American adults. Or maybe, to be more precise, this is among American young adults, so people of the college, people of the college age. The data with which I worked when I wrote this book 10 years ago was, according to our best statisticians, 20% among American adults, that is people from 18 to 54, and 20%, it means 1 in every 5 Americans. Now, for the first time, those diseases at an alarming rates that were noticed as a phenomenon in the general population of a society. The society was England in the 16th century, emerged together with nationalism. This is precisely at the time when nationalism emerges in England. For a long time, nationalism only characterized England. It wasn't as yet transferred anywhere else until the 18th century, so for about 2 centuries. And those diseases at that time were observed only in England. And they were called the English malady. So French, for example, who observed that, they were extremely surprised, and that was something peculiar about England. And there was already a psychiatric, physically, well, there was no psychiatry, but there was the very first hospital in the case of a curing establishment was in fact a hospital established for those diseases, for those functional mental diseases, and it was the Bedlam Hospital in London, and it was a very common site for visits from abroad to come to this very peculiar institution and to look at this very peculiar English phenomenon that didn't exist anywhere else. And then, remarkably, as nationalism spread, so with nationalism, those diseases arrived in those countries which have developed nationalism.
And how would exactly that correlation worked?
Well,
correlation maybe is a warm word.
yeah.
How do they?
Yeah.
How does that spread? Something like what Ben Anderson talks about.
That is the extraordinary thing, right? That historically this is how it is. Now, what is nationalism? What is nationalism? Nationalism is a form of consciousness, first of all, which is the consciousness of modernity, the cultural framework of modernity, a form of consciousness in which reality is seen, specifically social reality is seen, as sovereign communities of fundamentally equal members. It is, in other words, a democratic consciousness, right? It is egalitarian in its very essence. It's built on the principles of popular sovereignty, that is self-government of the people, and it is built on the concept of the equality, fundamental equality of all the people, inequality, right? So it's fundamental because of those two principles. Being equal to every other member of your community and being a bearer of sovereignty of the community, the individual is seen as free, right? The individual is no longer made by God or defined by his or her social environment. No, it's the other way around. The individual is one's own maker, and the environment, the social environment, is defined by the individuals. So you have a situation in which one has a national identity. But the national identity is the identity of a very large group, right? And one also has to define one's individual identity. But one now has to define it. It is the responsibility of every one of us. We have to make ourselves. We have to decide what to be. We're given control of our own identity, and we're given lots of choices, but we have to make a decision. It is up to us. For most people, it is a very difficult responsibility. Now, when you think about functional mental diseases are diseases related to self-definition, to one's sense of oneself. In depression, one suffers from self-loathing. One undervalues oneself, right? One is full of dissatisfaction with oneself. One is ashamed. And because identity is tightly related, identity, which is a relationally constituted self, which is a self in relation to one's reality, identity is tightly related to the acting self, to what we call the will. When one is suffering from depression, one also suffers from absolute lack of motivation. It's difficult to get up in the morning, impossible to, everything is just impossible. In manic depression, one constantly oscillates between this kind of depression, that is where you loathe yourself, and mania, which is very often connected to overestimation of oneself. So megalomania, mania of grandeur, so one suddenly feels, I'm the prince of the universe, or whatever, Very often people, in the past, people had the sense of being Napoleon, in the 19th century, when Napoleon was the greatest of all ideals. Now, one would consider oneself a great scientist, or a savior of the world, with other things like that. In any case, very much overestimating one's capacities. And in terms of will, then, in terms of acting, one again varies between lacking motivation to do anything, and on the other hand, doing things which are completely not under control of one's will. Suddenly going on a killing spree, and because one has to, and one doesn't even know why, but suddenly there is this tremendous urge.
Driven basically by brain chemistry. Totally driven by brain chemistry, right?
No.
You don't think so?
No, not at all driven by brain chemistry. You see, there is, of course, the brain is, we are nothing without our bodies, right? We are only alive through our bodies. But it is the mind, the mind that gives instructions to the brain. We cannot think. Our thoughts are not products of our brain. Think about it this way. The brain, we cannot think without the brain, but brain doesn't produce thoughts. It supports thoughts. It's like a computer, a word processor. and what you write on it.
Mm-hmm.
You cannot write it on a computer without the computer.
Mm-hmm.
But it is not the computer that produces what you write, right? So you also can think about it as the stomach, any other organ. The stomach digests the food, right? It processes the food. It doesn't create it.
Mm.
The food comes from outside, right? It is independent from the stomach.
How to conceptualize minds then?
The mind processes culture. It's like digestion. You see? This, of course, it is the brain that is the food processor. But the food is not created, in the stomach. It doesn't grow out of the stomach. You take it in. The process of digestion is analogous to the mind. The organ of the brain is processing, but the process is the mind. It consists of what you took from outside. So the mind, this is what I call it in the book, it's culture in the brain. It's the individualized culture. You see? The experiences and the messages of culture that you perceive, right? And then the brain processes it. Person can think about the stomach again. There can be poison, right? That you put inside and you die.
Let's get into the manic part. It is a very concrete and interesting thing. Yeah. So let's see the bipolar disorder and the manic episode.
Yeah.
Something is very like, as you described briefly, perhaps actions are not controlled. There is a lot of
all sorts of things that. Yeah.
The question then is, where is the brain chemistry and where is the mind? Because there is the flow of information that is, and certain actions.
Yeah. Let me again return to the stomach. You see, there are three possibilities of diseases. You can have a problem with your stomach. So you take all the good food, and the stomach is okay. And the stomach is not okay. So you cannot digest your food because the stomach is not okay. And then there is also a different thing. You can take poison and your stomach is completely perfect. You have a great stomach. But you take poison. You will digest it and it would kill you, even though your stomach is 100% healthy. So think about it, You of course can have a mental disease if you, bumped your head and something is wrong with your brain. But you can also have a mental disease if the culture that surrounds you is poisonous. Now, those rates, that's why it is important to think about rates. You see, those diseases in individual rare cases could exist always. But the history gives us, an index that something happened not to the brain, but to the intake from outside. Because if it happened in the brain, it would mean a true genetic change in the human beings. That suddenly, those diseases that existed in 1 out of 10,000 cases. Suddenly they exist in 2 out of every 5. It cannot be biologically explained. It cannot be organically explained. But it can be explained by the kind of mental food that you take in.
What's the solution there?
What's the solution? Education is the solution.
How to fix the intake and the stomach? I mean, is there any systematic thing?
Only education, only interpretation of what is happening around you,
which is also part of the cultural lenses.
What? So because it happens to the food you take in, you see, not to your stomach, not to the organ that you have inside.
Could one interpret our conversation as, again, because it's going public, and I'm very careful with that, in a sense of being skeptical towards the intake of medicine, towards that?
Yes.
Could it be interpreted as
yes.
that we're generally skeptical about the dealing with the medical approaches towards this mind-brain dichotomy?
Yes. Unfortunately, this is what there is. You see, we have been trying to counter this horrible development, the constant increase in rates, and the constant lowering of the age of onset. So let's say 200 years ago, it would be a grown-up person who would suffer from this disease. It became adolescents. Now it is children who may have those diseases, you see? So it becomes more and more tragic. And for over 200 years, since the emergence of psychiatry, the first medical specialization that emerged, So they're trying to stop it. They cannot. They're trying to cure it in individual cases. They cannot. There is no cure for those diseases. You see, most medicines that manage it, they cannot cure, they only can manage.
Right.
That manage it were created for completely other things. They weren't even created for those diseases, But they, when they tried them, they had this unexpected consequence, and they helped, but they only help. Very often, however, they do change brain chemistry and damage the organ of the brain without curing the mental disease. They actually have terrible results for the physical health. So, it is, medical way doesn't work. Not at all. So,
in your book, you present extensive case histories of individuals with mental illness. Can you share some insights from these case studies that illustrate the relationship between modernity, madness, and the societal pressure for self-realization?
Right. Well, it is very clear that in cases of severely mentally ill people, this disease was originally called madness. The word that was invented for that in the 16th century English is madness. So what we are talking about a society going mad. So whenever you deal with individual cases of severe mental impairment and analyze this person's social environment, it is always an inability to form an individual identity in the conditions of acute anomie. That is, in the conditions of numerous choices. When an individual has numerous choices, and first is either unclear, uncertain about the choice one is making, or it turns to be a bad choice, and their identity remains unformed. So, having no identity, one suffers from a terrible impairment of the will. It is always like that. Now we have apparently a lot of cases because a huge amount of choices is constantly getting huger, right? And a very important choice has been added quite recently, and this is the choice of sex. And transgender, or one can choose to be a transgender. And sometimes a person may feel very unhappy in one's body, right? This is in general. When we talk about those mental illnesses, functional mental illnesses, it of course includes a feeling of terrible unhappiness. You're not comfortable, as they say, in your skin. You're not comfortable. You're maladjusted to the world. So wherever you are, you're not comfortable. And of course, it is very directly related to your discomfort with your own sense of self. If you do know who you are, you wouldn't be comfortable in your environment, right? So sometimes a person is uncomfortable with one's body because one is suffering from this anomic situation. And then there is this possibility of changing sex. And it is a drastic choice. And so people then go and change sex. And then we learn that the amounts of suicides among this group is larger than among any other group because it is such a drastic choice. And it doesn't improve their mental health in a colossal percentage, in comparison to other groups. The mental health situation of those people deteriorates. You see, so this is the situation of what the choice, the freedom of choice, and the absolute equality of people.
Now, as we getting to the conclusive part of this, given the implications of your research, what policy recommendations or interventions do you propose to address the challenges faced by individuals and the modern egalitarian societies who may be struggling with mental health as a result of these societal pressures?
Well, what I propose is the change in the education system. The change in the education system and the use of literature for very young children that would make an identity, one's identity, more dependent on something easily achievable rather than on all those numerous choices that one cannot evaluate. And specifically, I'm talking it must begin with very young children. So I'm thinking about such literature which doesn't exist in Western countries, unfortunately. such literature that existed, for example, in Russia. Such children's literature as Muha, a tale where what you have, the situation, it's about insects, but the young child can identify oneself with those insects. So there is a fly. She is a girl, and some bad spider tries to hurt it. So spider is a villain. But a very brave mosquito comes in, a boy mosquito. And this boy mosquito fights the spider and saves the girl. So the child, first of all, there is a very clear difference, very clear picture of good versus evil. And the good versus evil, good is helping somebody in need. Evil is trying to hurt somebody, to cause somebody suffering. So the little child now sees this is how the world is. And this little child can identify either with a suffering girl, and it doesn't matter, this is a fly, you can change it, or with a brave mosquito, there is. And again, you don't have to look in your own physical characteristics for whatever it is, but you build your identity as a good person,
But easily achievable goals is an incredible buzzword. I'm having lived in Sweden, I think that's a very relatable thing, that how the Swedish kindergartens, where I have a 5-year-old daughter, and I know how Swedish kindergartens work and how much of a benchmark is easily achievable goal for them.
Yeah.
And kids are generally happy with things. And that is, I think, is a very convincing point when it comes to policy, what to do, not to have like maximalist expectations that either Harvard or MIT or die, but just something achievable for the kid.
I will become a good person. This is what I am, and then you are trying to help wherever you can help, right? And you're fighting evil wherever you see somebody trying to hurt somebody, right?
You argue in your book that principles of popular sovereignty, equality, and secularism in modern nationalism place citizens under enormous psychic strain. How do you think these principles specifically contribute to development of mental illness like manic depression, schizophrenia, which you discuss? Is there a sort of direct relationships with particular diseases, or in general, as you described, sort of mind is blown by the extent of stress? Or is there some sort of...
No, it's very specific.
Specific about this particular...
society. Then the society that is created, democratic society, created by nationalism, that is egalitarian society with individual freedom. You see, when the societies were inegalitarian, they were strictly stratified. First of all, one's identity was defined very strictly by one's environment. For example, one was born a shoemaker's daughter, right? This girl would know precisely what her aspirations in life could be. Why? Because she would certainly grow up and marry another shoemaker. There would be no other choice. She would become a mother of shoemakers. You see? She would dress in a certain way. That was the way shoemakers' community dress. Eat certain foods. Everything was strictly defined. Now, when we are all equal, we can compare ourselves to anyone, and we can want anything.
And with the social media, which is getting even more.
And this is, of course, getting even more. And that's why in the past 10 years or so, the rates of those mental illnesses doubled, practically doubled. If they double again, I mean, that is it. We live in a completely mad society. Now, think, even when I was writing this book 10 years ago, and the rate was 20%, 1 in 5 Americans, this was American rate, 1 in 5 Americans. This means 1 in 5 senators, 1 in 5 generals, 1 in 5 psychiatrists, 1 in 5 policemen, right? Okay, whose judgment you cannot trust because they're mentally ill. Understand?
Your work is, especially Mind, Modernity, and Madness, and this is my last question, is very often compared to Emil Durkheim's classic sociological study of suicide. How do you see your work in relationship to Durkheim?
Well, Durkheim, of course, has been extremely important for me. And yes, I actually, in the introduction to this book, I referred to Durkheim's suicide. And in general, Durkheim's idea in suicide, Durkheim's greatest contribution to our understanding of the world was to prove the reality, the absolute reality and importance of social facts, of mental phenomena, because this is how he defines social facts, right? Norms, collective representations, which can affect you as much as anything physical and much more. And my idea in this book was specifically to bring attention to the colossal power of culture in our life, far greater than anything else, again, in our life. I also mentioned that, of course, the influence of Durkheim for me has been, not only suicide, the most important concept that I used in all my books, in all of them, was anomie. Durkheim's concept developed first in the division of social labor, division of labor in society, and then in suicide too, but it is just the most powerful explanatory concept in Western social science altogether. So, yeah.
Well, what a talk and what an interesting conversation that was. Thank you for joining us on this journey, Professor Greenfeld. And everybody who listened to us, we look forward to bringing you more engaging conversations with top experts on the future episodes of Religion and Praxis. Until then, take care and stay curious.